Good afternoon and welcome back to March's Book Lovers Corner, our third broadcast for 2019. We're being broadcast on the Wairarapa Community Access radio station, Arrow FM 92.7. And we broadcast every fourth Tuesday of the month at 3:30 to 4:30 throughout the year. This is one of 12 community radio stations in New Zealand, and we are sponsored by the wonderful independent bookshop we have in Carterton, Elmo's Books. Here represented on our panel today and most monthly broadcasts with Sue from Elmo's Books, leaving Steve behind to look after the shop. You can listen to the program live online by connecting in with Arrow FM, or listen to it later via podcast, which you can download onto your device. You can either download from the Arrow FM's website or from YouTube. If you've put in the Book Lovers Corner Arrow FM on YouTube, you will come up with us on TV. We appreciate any feedback you can offer by contacting the station's Facebook page. Indicating a like for the program would help us to find out more about our audience. We do know that we have local, national and international listeners, and we would like to know more about you. I'm Valda Kirkwood. The other members of the team are Gareth Rapson. Hi, Gareth.
Good afternoon.
And Sue Lawrence. Hi,
Hello.
Sue.
Hello there.
And sometimes Julie Crosland will join us as an occasional contributor throughout the year. Today's outline of the program is first of all a discussion of books that we've read since our latest broadcast, and news of the books that we know about happening in New Zealand. And then Sue will discuss her books, Blood and Sugar by Laura Shepherd Robinson, about slavery in 18th century England, and also The First Muslim by Leslie Hazelton, which is the story of Muhammad. Gareth then will discuss his book Educated by Tara Westhover, and we will be discussing then a little about what makes one educated, because it's a book that does raise that question. It's non-fiction, American, and a great story of Tara's struggle to become educated, having grown up in the mountains of Utah and never going to school. But she ends up with postgrad degrees from Oxford and Harvard universities. We'll then have a music break, and when we come back, I will be focusing on Empress of the East, How a Slave Girl Became Queen of the Ottoman Empire by Leslie Pearce. Please note this is not the New Zealand Leslie Pearce. Some of you may have read her books, but it is in fact the professor of history from New York University. We will conclude with a summary of the books reviewed, and we will start today with news of books. Sue, would you like to tell us about what books are flying out of Elmo's at the moment, please?
I would. There's an easy winner in the children's section, which is the book Old Russian Jack, which is a new children's book written by Tanya Atkinson and illustrated by the wonderful Viv Walker. It was launched in our shop on last week and has been selling really strongly ever since.
And isn't there a statue of him by the library?
There is, in Masterton. Yes, exactly right. An interesting character. A beautiful book. Yeah.
Did anything come out of the book launch that was kind of fun?
Well, the whole thing is fun because we had Russian Jack wine.
Oh, and that that was lovely wine.
Right.
So, though Viv did have her storyboards and some of her illustrations, which are wonderful, as ever. Second in the children's sales is Fing by David Williams, which is not so good for English, but I suppose all right for reading. And the third, I've sort of pulled these together. This is the Dragon Defender series in New Zealand by the New Zealand writer James Russell. It's about dragons and set in Auckland. And kids, boys about 8 or 9 in particular, really love them. My grandson in particular. Non-fiction, the bestseller we've had is Kim Workman's Journey Towards Justice.
And that's going to be just Kim Workman is going to be at Why Word, isn't he?
Exactly right.
This coming Sunday.
Exactly.
No, not this coming Sunday.
Sunday week.
Sunday the 7th, is it?
Yeah, Sunday fortnight,
Yes.
whenever that is. But he's next in Why Word, and he also was a speaker in Greytown, and so he's been around the Wairarapa talking about his book. So that's great. Second is also a Wairarapa book, Relax, Say Goodbye to Anxiety and Panic, and that was on the bestseller list last month as well. This is by the GP Patrick McCarthy, who has a little advantage in that he's able to prescribe his own book to his patients, but never mind, it's selling really well and is obviously doing some good. The third one is a brand new book to the shop, which is The Uninhabitable Earth, A Story of the Future, by David Wallace Wells, which is hyphenated. It's a book about climate change. Fiction, Lee Child still reigns supreme. Secondly, Lucinda Riley, The Seven Sisters, possibly because we had it such a bargain price, people can't resist. But third in the list is Call Me Evie, which is a New Zealand crime book set in Rotorua, by a young author called J.P. Pomari. The other thing I want to mention while I've got the floor is the Auckland Writers' Festival coming up in May, the 13th to 19th of May. Have a look, see if you can get the program. We have copies in Elmo's books.
Thank you. Anything from... I think there's one bit of information about books that's been pretty devastating for people in Wellington and the wider Wellington region, Gareth.
Right. When the closure of the Central Library in Wellington certainly has got the city in a furore, and quite rightly so. I mean, it's an institution and much loved by the book lovers of the city, and we're all waiting to see what the head librarian is going to offer in its place. And there's been lots of speculation, but the ratepayers of the city are going to say, "What are you doing?" So watch this space.
Well, and I think we will be able to talk a little bit more about that next month, because I have been reading I am reading at the moment, the library book by Susan Orlean. And that is an absolutely fascinating story that I didn't know about, nor did you, Sue, either, till we talked about it in our pre-podcast meeting. And it's something we should all read to make us realise what libraries mean to us. And I think next month we will all be talking about our connections and our passions about libraries in our past and currently. And Gareth will be getting us up to date on what's happening in Wellington, which we all await with interest.
Yes, absolutely.
So I think we'll now move on to our main menu for today. Sue, would you like to kick us all off, please, with your books?
I shall. So I've got 2 books, as has been said. The first one is fiction, and I love historic fiction. That's one of my passions. This is Blood and Sugar, set in London in 1781, or more specifically 5 miles upriver, or to the east. It's not upriver, downriver. Is in Deptford, which is the entrance, the gateway port. It's a crime novel, but it's also primarily a novel about the slave trade and the iniquity of that business. We have a hero. He's a war hero from the American Wars. His name is Harry Corsham, and he discovers that a great friend that he had in Oxford has been murdered and his body found hanging on a pole at Deptford. So Harry, being a man of action, decides that he's going to find out what exactly happens. This book is based on fact. The ship there is a ship in the that is central to the story called the Dark Angel, and that is a slave ship, and it's notorious because it pushed its cargo of slaves overseas due to a water shortage. Now, that was an actual happening in the year 1781. The ship Zong did that, and the crew did that, and it was a subject of a big court case by the then Lord Chief Justice Mansfield, who ruled against the slavers being able to claim insurance for the loss of their property. Now that, interestingly enough, is the subject of quite a good movie called Belle. Belle, the central character, was raised, she's a mulatto, as they called him, and she was raised in Lord Chief Justice Mansfield's
I think
home.
I've heard of that film.
So,
Yep.
very interesting story. But back to Blood and Sugar. It's an action-packed story. There's a vast list of characters, and like lots of Russian novels, it has a character list at the front. I would like to see more from this author. I think her research is impeccable. Her bringing together of a complex plot is done really well. So I'm looking forward to her next book, really, and hopefully it'll have Harry Corsham. My second book is far more serious matter, a book by Leslie Hazelton, whose talks, you'll find TED Talks on YouTube, and she has written several books around the Muslim religion. This is the first Muslim. This actually was given to me by my son, who has been a Muslim for 18 years since his marriage to the beautiful Mira. And so he left this with me last time he was here and said, "Mum, you might like to read this one day." And it sat on my bedside table for 6 months. And so given the terrible events of 10 days ago, I decided if there's ever a time to read this book, it is now. So I have read it. I finished it in 3 days. It's highly readable, impeccably researched, a very interesting story. It explains the reason for the split in the Sunni and Shiite factions of Islam. It describes the life of Muhammad, and he was an interesting character in himself. And so Islam is sort of the latest of the three big religions, and the events described in this book occur in the 7th century in Arabia. So I would urge you to look out for this or similar books in your library or in your bookshop. It's well worth getting to grips with the issues of the day in this way, by starting with the history.
Thank you, Sue.
I'll take questions.
So there's no doubt there's a sort of heightened consciousness, and you think this is like a really good pathway into...
I do. My son gave me 2 books, and he said, "Mum, start with the story of Muhammad first." That would be his advice, and I think it was good advice, because it doesn't get into the intricacies of the religion. It describes his path towards the religion, and he had a very strong first wife who played a huge part in the development of that. So,
and interestingly, the book that I'm going to be talking about, which I heralded last month, and it's quite fortuitous to be talking about it at the moment, it's also a description of a very strong woman, but also the changes that can happen within a religion, and how that there's changes and adaptations and new ways of living happening all the time.
Absolutely, yeah. This book talks very much about the links to the Jewish religion and to Christianity as well, and their shared beginnings in many aspects. So it's really interesting from that point of view. And I am not a religious person at all, but I found this highly readable and very, very informative and interesting.
Well, it was very informative for me when I was doing my circumnavigation of Turkey in 2011, of going into Abraham's birthplace, and how Abraham is very much revered in the Islamic religion as one of the prophets.
Yes.
And I think, I think there's so much we can all learn to be much more inclusive of all forms of life, other than ones that we've known.
I agree.
So, and we're going, we've sort of got a focus of slavery or enslavement, and I think that what you're going on to then, Gareth, is all about enslavement, not necessarily physical enslavement in the form of slaves being imported into a country to be used for whatever purpose that they were taken in for, but enslavement of the spirit. So would you like to tell us about that, please?
I will. But before we do that,
absolutely.
We've got 2 books, and the first one, very briefly, is...
Which was left off last time because we got so excited about what we were talking about otherwise.
Now, this is a reprint of...
Yep, brilliant.
The,
that was brilliant where it was. So,
okay.
Yep.
Of Colin Wheeler's historic sheep stations of New Zealand. Now, in the 1960s, he visited 70-odd sheep stations and published 3 books, which were hugely popular. Keep in mind, this was a time when sheep was king in New Zealand. They drove our economy, and it was... and there was a great curiosity about these hidden away grand stations, especially that are just not available to the public. The book's been reprinted, and Wairarapa figures in it, actually. There are 3 sheep stations that he visited, and one was Castle Point. And there's a bit of an example of Colin Wheeler's work, giving an interesting perspective of the, probably the most painted lighthouse on our coast.
And very different view from what you normally see.
Right,
the
from
lighthouse.
the sweeping down, and also gives you a chance to look at his palette, which is a very sort of a lot of ochres and browns, and very summary look at it. But Wheeler was an artist, an art teacher at Waitaki Boys, and on the strength of these books left his teaching job and had a very good career painting, and was a sort of much loved New Zealand artist, figuring in the Keller art competitions and all that. I imagine, Sue, Elmo's could source a book like this?
We could, certainly.
Yeah, it's a bit of a coffee table book, but one I think you would really enjoy.
And I think before you move on, I'll never forget going to Britain when I first went in the 70s, and the population of sheep in New Zealand was the same as the population of people in Britain at that time, 60 million.
Yeah.
And I think now the number of sheep,
down.
it's way down. Is it 6 million or something?
Yeah, it's under 20.
It's fewer than dairy cows now.
It's quite an extraordinary transition within about 50 years.
Second book.
Thank you.
Tara Westover's book, Educated. Now, this was in Time Magazine's top 10 books of 2018, and it's one of these books which has got out to a worldwide audience. And it's a story. It's a non-fiction book of Tara growing up in the mountains of Utah in a survivalist family where she is. Her birth is not registered. The family is anti-government. It wants nothing to do with bureaucracy. Keeps to themselves. They're in the business of preparing for the apocalypse. So they're preparing food and bunkers of fuel, and they're going to be the ones that survive. And Tara is in here. She's taught to read. She keeps a journal, but basically her life is working on the father's scrap metal, small engineering business, and she works in amongst her brothers. In fact, the whole family works and from this she is, and she's also in a Mormon family. Now that's sort of in the book sort of has a sort of an acceptance of the Mormon faith, but here we have a young woman ensnared, sort of caught up in this emotionally abusive.
But not just emotionally abusive. I mean, the pictures that I still have of her working in the father's scrap metal thing, and the father making her do, this young girl who's physically not particularly able, doing some of the most horrific things within
with huge bits of equipment, and the whole family is getting damaged and beaten up when they're or inevitably in car wrecks, and they're scarred, and they're either on fire because they're burnt, taking out fuel, the petrol things that are wrecked cars. But anyway, Tara has a desire to, and like some of them in the family, that you're either in this family escaped or you were kind of locked in, and she decides that she will get educated, and now faces the dilemma of how do you go to college when you haven't been to high school, and you need to get a score on an SAT test, and she has no mathematics, and so what we are facing, the conundrum that Tara faces, and we see her work her way through it by using family members to just one after another overcome obstacles. And the question is, the education she got from not going to school, this homeschooling sort of issue, which for her was so little and so marginal, but she came through with a pile of qualities. But what is being educated?
Well, it has to do with life skills, clearly, from that book.
From this book, you better pick up some skills, and Tara has some, and you know, there's, and it's. The attraction is like just how does she overcome the battle with arriving at Brigham Young University, which I have been to, and we just happened to be in Salt Lake City, and we went to see where the Tabernacle Choir sings. A beautiful campus, but you could imagine Tara there, lost, very little money, working all day, flipping hamburgers, going to classes with no idea how the university works, and being told that she doesn't really belong here. She just doesn't have the intellectual grasp of it. Anyway, the story awaits you as you go on her eye-opening experience of how she becomes a terrific scholar, and the qualities, that the perseverance, the physical strength, the kind of insights that she's gained from this life in the mountains, in fact, translates into academic growth. She gets a chance to go to England, to Oxford, but there's still this dysfunctional family running in tandem with her, trying to reach, and she keeps visiting and getting drawn back into this family that she loves but must leave. Very modern, a terrific read, and recommended to you.
So who were her role models?
Well, this is a good question. Who were her role models? I mean, her readings were heavily prescribed by her Mormonism, so they would be the good and worthy books that the parents would decide that she could read. I mean, so there would not. I mean, she tells about going to a lecture, and the first lecture, and putting a hand up and asking what does the word Holocaust mean, and the class and the professor are stunned that she has just no historic. She's going to get her degrees in history, but she has no knowledge. And
in fact, they thought she was joking,
right,
and it made it even worse.
And she didn't put her hand up too often.
No,
but
not after that.
But the book is beautiful for reaching out where teachers will find a willing student, and she is helped by her family, and then she's helped by her teachers at university, who suddenly realise that they have a Pygmalion character here, that this is a young woman with a blank slate, gifted, academically, if they can only access this. And people spend a lot of time teaching her to write and understand the sort of academic world. It is fascinating. I can see why this book has...
Yes, and as Stephen Fry says, marvellous. There is no feeling like discovering a young writer who is springing up fully armed with so much talent.
Right, and this reads. It's one of those books you pick it up and you go, I understand. I'm with you, Tara, and then you really are kind of just, as her story unfolds, even though it's frighteningly sort of confronting at times, we know that just by her that and it's not sentimental. It's kind of she has a great world view that we come to like as well.
But it also raises the question: what does educated mean?
Right, people educated in her case, the harshness of being almost a slave on her parents' engineering company.
Well, and not just the engineering company, in the kitchen. There was the bottling of all those peaches forever, it seemed to me, that they were bottling and bottling and bottling and then, putting away for the final days and all sorts of things. So she was actually working, doing the female role with her mother, but doing the male role out in the scrap metal part of the business with her father. I mean, extraordinary skills she would have learnt from those, because it brought up what we were discussing before, how you said she had that resilience. She had
a range of qualities, and only later she's able to see that the father, for being mentally ill, filled with neurosis, and really in a way not her, but she still loves him. There's still this great love of family, the love of her home that she spent her youth in, and she endlessly returns, and suddenly she's back into this maelstrom of paranoia that sweeps around her, and also the poor young Mormon girls that become the wives of her brothers, who she sees enslaved and trapped in something that they didn't know what they were buying into.
So is she essentially the only one that escapes?
No, what's interesting is like 2 or 3 of them get out and they all become well educated, and the ones that don't
are stuck.
Yeah, they are stuck in this this kind of parental spider web that will not let them go. Rather bleak, but
but also very affirming, because
yes, it is.
The teachers must have recognised the value of her life skills and life experience, and what she brought into the academic environment. So that's a positive message for a lot of young people out there, I think.
Well, I think so, because also she went from America to Britain to study. Now, that's changing cultures yet again.
Yes.
So in going from the culture of the culture she was brought up in and raised in a sort of uneducated view, and then going to the university in the Harvard, wasn't it?
Harvard.
And then over to Britain. What in very short space of time.
Right, and
just amazing.
And it had a little, and probably to close on it, she asks for help at one stage, and a professor sits her down and takes her through an essay, line by line, word by word. And I had a similar experience at Victoria, where Professor Bertram in the English department asked to see me, took me through paragraph after paragraph, looking at the structure, and it was a completely humiliating experience of just how terrible and bad it was. And I mean, I walked out of there, and he'd asked me to rewrite it and submit it the next day. But I actually walked out of there feeling like, do I actually belong? When you suddenly see what you thought was good to be absolutely so kind of weak. But that's the point you have, is like, that's rise up to the occasion, the challenge, do it better the next time. This book is full of meeting challenges, and you will be excited and love Tara's growth through this book.
So what does she do now apart from write that book?
I think she is an academic in the I think she's still an American academic.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you, Gareth. We'll now go to a musical interlude and we'll come back in about 3 minutes. Thank you. Welcome back to Book Lovers Corner on Arrow FM 92.7 and sponsored by Elmer's Books of Carterton. So we're continuing on, and this time it's my turn to talk about the book that I've been entranced with, having also been entranced with the Educated by Tara Westover at the end of last year. I've been more recently recommended by my neighbour Judy, who was just bowled over by it and read it in one weekend. And it's called Empress of the East by Leslie Pierce. And she is not the Leslie Pierce that we're familiar with in New Zealand. This one is Leslie, Leslie, and Pierce, Peirce. And it is the story of a young woman who was purchased off non-Ottomans, and she came from Russia. They used to go in and just grab whole villages of people, and all the young women, particularly the attractive young women, became slaves and then concubines in the Ottoman Empire. And this is what indeed happened to Roxolana. They don't know her original name. She was called Roxolana, although when she became part of the Ottoman Empire, her name was Hurrem, and which means, I think, joyful. So they must have had some reason for. She must have had a sort of personality in order to get that name, and I found it's been very educative for myself. It made me realise, even though I have travelled around Turkey and got some sort of an induction into the Islamic faith, this was going back in history to see how it originated in terms of the Mongols. We know about the Mongols and Genghis Khan. We grew up on that, and they actually became the grey Tartars, or slave traders, and were often based sort of in the northern Black Sea area, places like the Crimean Peninsula, or that area. Whereas Genghis Khan, he set up a migration to Anatolia, which we now know as the eastern part of Turkey, the Asian part of Turkey, and it ended up, his family tree ended up with Osman in 1324, taking leadership of a Turkic tribal federation, and from there that you got the Ottoman Empire. And when we between Osman in 1324, you had 37 sultans till 1922. And what was very interesting about reading this was not only the history of how the Ottoman Empire developed, and then focusing on one particular sultan in particular, Suleiman the Magnificent. And for me, it was really interesting because I could remember going to the Melbourne Museum when I was working in Melbourne, going to the Melbourne Museum, which was then located in the State Library, and there was an exhibition of Suleiman the Magnificent's artefacts. And I was absolutely fascinated at the time, and I'd forgotten all about it till I was reading this, and the wealth. And we were talking about the Joanna Lumley's Silk Road adventure that you can see on the TV on a Sunday night, and the magnificence of the buildings there. And so all this is sort of part of it. So it's cropping up in all sorts of ways at the moment. And so the word association, slave, and I had never thought about where did the word slave come from. And of course it's because most of the slaves were from the Slavic area. And so you get the word slave. And I had never thought of that slave trade in that area of the world. You think of Africa to the United States, but we hear far less of the slave trade between Russia, the Slavic areas, down to, for example, in the Ottomans. And Gareth, you were asking me about what happened to them all. And so the women, on the whole, became slaves, and then, if they were attractive enough, became concubines in Topkapi Palace, for example, which we've visited. The men became eunuchs, or became part and parcel of the public service jobs that were required in the empire.
And you mentioned something about they could earn their freedom.
Yes, and it seemed this is again very well researched books with plenty of notes at the back, and a list of all the guys, the sultans that led the Ottoman Empire. And they it would appear that they, after 7 years, they gained their freedom, which is quite a different way of looking at slavery from one that we're familiar with, perhaps more familiar with.
But you used to be able to buy your freedom in England.
So, this international, and they were from all over the place. So you can imagine there was an enormous diversity of people, and that was called the International Slave Pool. And everyone's, they were converted to learning a new language, striving to please and forget. And what a challenge that would have been. We talk about Tara Westover's challenges to go from where she grew up to an academic. Well, these ones, you got into a whole new, you had to learn a whole new culture and language, and yet you were still trying to keep hold of your own faith and
culture,
that you were familiar with. And what a struggle that would have been. Other words that, apart from slave, that you become familiar with is sultan or sultana for the female, haram, seraglio, Ottoman, vizier, eunuch, pasha, janissary, Khan, and one we hear a lot about, or have heard a lot about recently, is the caliphate. And so you've got an enormous cultural experience that I was unfamiliar with, and learned a great deal. And you have this young woman pulled away from her village, her way, her language, her culture, her ways of being involved in the world, to ending up in the old palace in Topkapi Palace in Istanbul, and ending up as one of the concubines of Suleiman the Magnificent. And this was in the mid-1500s. And her journeying from being a slave to ending up being a queen of Empress of the East, the Queen of the Ottomans, was just such an enormous change in tradition that had happened previously. Previously, a concubine presented the Ottoman Empire with a son, and they were then, the mother was focused on bringing up that son in the whole business of becoming a sultan. And they were farmed out to the distant areas of the empire to train to become the next sultan by managing a particular district or area of the empire.
It sounds like the subject matter of fiction, almost, of what's happened to it, or movies. The sort of the flower girl to princess.
It's like that. I mean, it's told like that, but it wasn't easy.
But she must have been an extraordinary.
Well, she through all the women in the old palace who were to become the concubines or again part of managing the part of the empire that was necessary then. And they learnt to speak and read, all the women. They had instruction in religion and law of Islam, or Muhammad's religion and law. They learnt etiquette and political ideology. They learnt about the ceremonies and customs. They learnt to sew and embroider. They learnt to play the harp and sing. And this was all within an international network. And so they would be learning other languages. They would be learning other cultures as well, because the women would be all, they were in a school.
So is this just the pretty ones, though?
No, I don't think this is all of them. It was like an institute of higher education.
Golly.
And systematic education of large numbers of women. Now, that's for me, that was an eye-opener and an extraordinary education of women. So they went from uneducated women from peasant origins and villages right beyond the empire to becoming very educated women.
And central to the
empire's future. Absolutely.
So sex slave and part of the packages you get.
You get education.
A better
Get music
life. Yeah.
lessons.
Get music.
And learn to embroider.
Right.
But this Roxolana was just, I think, must have been one out of the box, because normally, the Sultan would have his concubine who would produce a boy, and off out of it. Somehow or other, Roxolana broke that tradition, and she produced 6 offspring to the Sultan. She wasn't sent off. She was allowed to go back and have more children, and that was significant breaking of the tradition.
And giving her huge power.
And enormous power.
Because in the early, when she first arrived, just surviving palace intrigues must have been incredibly dangerous for all the more senior women in front of her.
There was the Sultan's mother to deal with and get on with. Make sure you got on with.
Always an
But
issue.
then was also the mother of Suleiman's first child. And so you've got all that intrigue that she must have been a very, very astute, clever, well-informed woman. And she ended up breaking the mould to being able to have so that the Sultans, so he had a sort of a nuclear family arrangement, which had never been part of the tradition up till then. Now to achieve that, they wrote letters to each other, because the Ottoman Empire didn't happen. He was off to war, up to Hungary, over to Iran, all over the place. But that she wrote to him while he was away. He wrote to her, and these letters were part of the research data that Leslie used. There was also very big links with other parts of the nations of that time, of Europe at that time. And so there was a Venetian, they had reports from the Ottoman Empire to Venice, to the Senate. And so you have all those reports as well. There's an enormous amount of data from the mid-1500s to create this book. I could just go on, because I just found it utterly engrossing. And she ended up working with across Western and Eastern empires. She was in communication with the females, and the top females in Europe. And yet they come from very, very different traditions. The tradition of weddings and coronations and so on, which we comprehend as being part of the European tradition, wasn't part of the Ottoman Empire at all. What they celebrated over longer periods of time were in fact the circumcisions of the young sultans-to-be. And that's so different. And it made me remember when I was in Istanbul, going and having up to the coffee place up the hill from the hotel, and near the wall that existed, that encapsulated Istanbul in old times, and seeing this amazing performance. And I sort of was asking, I found one of the waiters who could speak English, and I said, what is going on here? And it was a circumcision ceremony, and it was within the bounds of the old walls, and everybody was dressed up, and they were carrying gifts, and there was the young guy all dressed up as a mini sultan. It was just the most amazing out of this world experience. And so if you want to have your eyes opened to a world that we wouldn't normally have access to, read this book, Empress of the East by Leslie Pierce, and it was only published last year in 2018. Well worthwhile a read.
Golly.
So
do you know of any of the other people that she used to write to? You mentioned other women in Europe.
No, that was sort of just like
Is that in passing?
summer in passing.
Yeah.
But what an extraordinary person.
That's a whole. There's more yet to explore.
Oh,
in relation
absolutely.
to her then, isn't there?
Was it an academic book, or
No, it's worthy of being an academic book.
And it reads.
It's very easy to read.
Right.
And it's in the back, it's got lots of helpful things like the list of sultans, when, and so on. It gives a list of pronunciation for Turkish words, which I had to come to grips with when I was travelling around Turkey. And I'm intrigued when I hear Erdogan mentioned on radio broadcasts and that. And one of the things is the G in the Turkish language is not pronounced G. It means you lengthen the vowel before it. So instead of being Erdogan, it is Erdogan, but the O in front of the A is, so it separates the O and the A, and you put more emphasis on, you elongate the O before the A.
The idea of modern day Turkey, that Erdogan wants to be the next sultan, is that how does that play? I mean, at the moment he's the president, but this is a country that is transitioning out of the secular state of Kemal Atatürk into a Muslim Islamic state,
and that.
Does the book pick up on that sort of?
No, it doesn't. No, it doesn't. But when I was there, you could see that transition starting to happen. And we were actually travelling. Our tour guide that was with us around Turkey. We found out in the end it was the same time of the year in the electoral cycle as is currently happening in Turkey. And our tour guide was the mayor of a Black Sea area.
Right.
And we ended up, and we were saying to him around the trip, oh golly, you'd be great as a politician, you're just made for politics. We kept on he never said a word, but when we got to Kars in Far East or northeast Turkey, he had to suddenly go because he was required, because Erdogan was actually visiting his area and he had to go there and be the mayor. And so we were very blessed in actually getting an insight into Turkey that we were unaware we were getting because of that. And and going briefly back to Roxanana before we go on to summarising today's session, she actually left an enormous legacy. She set up a lot of foundations, charitable foundations, in the terms of schools and soup kitchens and mosques. Just left quite a vestige behind.
It seems like it's a good example of the exceptional woman story, that suddenly, often these figures bypassed by the sweep of history, but academics and historians reaching back and finding the role of significant woman, in fact, that played a huge part in our history.
And you were talking about an exceptional woman when you were reading The First Muslim.
That's right. Her name, I think it's Khadija, who was the first wife of Muhammad. She was a lot older than he was, but there was something about her, and she was also a widow. So there was something about her that made her choose him, and they had a long and successful marriage of 24 years, I think. Then he went on to have subsequent wives, but she was the only one to produce a son, who unfortunately died, and 3 daughters, I think. But they had a long and happy marriage, and that was through the time that he was receiving the revelations from God. So she was a huge support and sort of sounding board for him.
And so not only has the theme of today been about slavery in enslavement in various forms, but also emancipation and the strength and resilience of particular women who have made enormous impact in their areas. So, any comments on that before we talk about the books we've read today?
No, I have to agree.
No. Good synergy, good tying it together.
Right. So, Sue, can you mention your books, please?
Yes, certainly. No, the first one was fiction, a novel, in other words, Laura Shepherd Robinson's a first novel, Blood and Sugar, about the slave trade, the trade to support the sugar industry between Britain and the Caribbean. But it's seen through the eyes of a crime story, really. And also The First Muslim, which we've just been talking about again, the story of Muhammad, Leslie Hazelton, well worth a read.
First book, Historic Sheep Stations of New Zealand by Colin Wheeler, a book that'll appeal to artists and to all of us who kind of like to see the stories of the past of our great sheep stations. Second book, Educated. We all got educated somehow, and this path that Tara was on is different, engrossing, and in the end incredibly affirming. And
to yet another engrossing book, The Empress of the East by Leslie Pierce, published last year, accessible in the library and through Elmo's. And next month in April, we will be focusing on libraries and books in their different forms. So thank you for being with us today, and we look forward to seeing you in April. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Thank you, Sue.
Bye.
Goodbye, Gareth. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.